Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you all for joining us for this discussion tonight. This is a very much overlooked and yet much needed discussion to have in our communities to protect ourselves against unjust targeting, unfair targeting. My name is Lina Narian. I'm now an outreach volunteer with the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. It is a survivor-led organization that advocates on behalf of 265 political prisoners targeted in the U.S. war on terror. These are all Muslim men and women, and for our purposes, we define a Muslim political prisoner as a person who was targeted, criminally prosecuted, and imprisoned due to their political views, beliefs, associations, cultural identity, or activism. And all of these cases happened post 9/11. We were founded in 2010, and our mission is to defend civil liberties and freedoms, promote a fair U.S. criminal justice system, and advocate for the rights of political prisoners in the U.S. targeted in the so-called war on terror. So why are we here tonight? The event is called From 9/11 to 10/7, Protecting Our Communities Against a New Wave of Repression. Since October 7th, we've witnessed Israel carry out with impunity a genocidal war and dehumanization campaign against Palestinians in Gaza with the full backing of the U.S. government and the media. For more than 7 months, our communities have been glued to their screens, witnessing in real time the horrors unfold there. Feeling helpless to stop the ongoing atrocities, our anger and emotions are understandably at an all-time high. At the same time, we've experienced a resurgence of mass hysteria, fear-mongering, and anti-Muslim hate to levels not seen since 9/11. Tragically, it didn't take long for the racist rhetoric of U.S. media and politicians to have deadly consequences. On October 14 last year, Wadi al-Fayoumi, a Palestinian-American boy who had recently celebrated his 6th birthday, was stabbed to death following the attempted murder of his mother by their own landlord. Weeks later, we saw 3 college students who were shot in Vermont, just walking down the street wearing their keffiyehs. But the reason we're here today is because as many of us as Muslim Americans who have witnessed the political landscape after 9/11 understand, each time the U.S. prosecutes or funds a war overseas, it simultaneously wages a domestic war on targets in the U.S. and our very communities. Since Israel launched its war on Gaza, we began to see immediate attempts by elected officials to criminalize any and all support for Palestinian liberation. Several members of Congress labeled Palestine solidarity protests as, quote, pro-Hamas rallies. Many have actively called for law enforcement agencies like the FBI, DHS, and ICE to target the brave student activists. We're seeing putting everything on the line to demand their universities end their complicity in funding genocide and apartheid. Indeed, these agencies are designed to infiltrate and threaten communities, manufacture crimes, and quash dissent. As the government wages its war on terror 2.0, we at CCF are grateful to work with FBI whistleblower Terry Albury on our panel on what we hope will be a series of events, both virtual and around the country. We have 2 more tomorrow in the Atlanta area, to warn communities of the government targeting that has already begun and how to best protect ourselves. As a former agent of almost 20 years, Terry can provide intimate knowledge that very few can. Think of it as a know your rights, but with first-hand knowledge of exactly how the government operates. We're also joined by Kathy Manley, our legal director, who stumbled upon this work by chance when she represented a falsely accused imam in Albany, New York, named Yassin Arif. His case changed her life as she saw the FBI blatantly and deliberately set up an innocent man and framed him on a terrorism charge, only to later basically admit that it was about his ideology, or what they perceived was an ideology. 20 years later, she's still fighting for this cause. Most recently, she helped lead CCF's legal fight to win the compassionate release of 4 impoverished men who were entrapped and convicted in a case that their own presiding judge dubbed the, quote, unterrorism case. The men were sentenced to 25 years each, but were recently granted release by the judge. I'm also joined by Sarwat Malik from New Jersey, who serves as the political advocacy director at CCF, who's leading our community outreach work. And as I mentioned, we're joined by Terry Albury, a former FBI agent of 17 years, who blew the whistle in 2017 on the FBI's targeting of Muslim communities, not just as a matter of our own opinion or what we see, but actually as a matter of their own policy. Basically everything that we all believed was happening was confirmed in meticulous detail through a trove of documents that were leaked. These revelations were studied and published as part of a series of articles in The Intercept called The FBI Secret Rules, and I highly encourage everyone here to read them. Following his exposure as a whistleblower, Terry was prosecuted by the government for his courageous truth-telling and sentenced to 4 years in prison after accepting a plea agreement. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Kathy, who I'm going to lead this discussion. So I'd like Kathy to kind of take us back to that early post 9/11 climate, describe the landscape at the time, the impact of policies like the Patriot Act, how and why an organization like CCF was formed, and what you found in your own research on interterrorism prosecutions.
All right, thank you, Lena. So it's great to be here tonight. So as Lena was saying, I'm from Albany, New York, and one of the early cases post 9/11 was the case of Yassin Araf, and that totally, as Lena said, changed my life. And then a bunch of us in Albany who were shocked and horrified that these completely innocent people, because he had a co-defendant too, who was entrapped, could be sentenced to 15 years. We succeeded at getting 15 years instead of 30 years because of the community support. But we started looking at other cases to see if this was just an isolated example or if this was happening in other communities. And we found out that there were a lot of other cases around the country. And one of those cases was the case of Sami al-Arian, Lena's father. And he was lucky that he for the most part, beat his case. He was charged on ridiculous conspiracy charges with no real evidence. They were trying to use a dream he had against him as evidence. That shows how weak their evidence was. So he beat most of those charges, but it was a long, drawn-out saga, and he ended up having to be deported to Turkey in the end. But in any event, he founded CCF when he was under house arrest in 2010. He found out about us in Albany and some other people around the country that were dealing with similar cases, and he brought us all together in the apartment where he was under house arrest. We had to go to him because he couldn't come to us. And so that was how CCF got founded. And it was another lawyer in Albany, Steve Downs, who's also been very involved with CCF, who came up with the term that we call preemptive prosecution. And what that means is these are prosecutions of Muslims who haven't actually committed any crimes, but were targeted for prosecution either in a sting operation or on vague conspiracy or material support charges out of fear of what they might do in the future. So it was kind of like the former Vice President or Dick Cheney saying if there's a 1% chance that somebody might become a terrorist in the future, we have to preemptively go after them now to prevent anything from happening. So they went after a lot of innocent people and destroyed a lot of families and communities. And so we actually got a list of 600 cases that the Justice Department called terrorism cases between 2001 and 2015, convictions between 2001 and 2015, and we studied each one of them and we looked at whether there were any real crimes going on. And we published a report, which we have it at their table, but it's also available online. It's called Inventing Terrorists, and we published it through ICNA Social Justice. And we found that only 15 of those 600 cases were involved in actual or even attempted acts of violence in the US and a few others overseas. But 93% of the cases had strong elements of preemptive prosecution. There was no violence or even attempted violence unless it was promoted by an FBI informant, and then it's fake, right? It's manufactured. 70% of the cases were entirely 100% preemptive with no real crime at all, other than something manufactured by the FBI or material support charges where the person was trying to help people in need, like charitable cases where they were not even trying to help support anything violent. And I just want to quickly go through a few examples, and then we got to keep moving, so let me know if I go too long, but one of the examples, and you may have heard of this, is the Holy Land Foundation case. This was the largest Muslim charity in the country. Some of the most wonderful people I've ever met. I gotta go fast and get through this without crying, but no, there's really wonderful people who ran this, who were trying to help people in Palestine and all over the world who desperately needed this aid, and they were not giving any money to anything to do with violence. And the government wasn't even trying to say that they were. They charged them with material support to terrorism for giving money to Zakat committees in Gaza, the same Zakat committees that the Red Cross and United States Agency for International Development, so the United States government, was giving money to the very same groups. But when the Holy Land Foundation did it, because they're Muslim and they're Palestinian, they got charged. Their first trial was a mistrial. The government kept going after them. This was in Dallas, Texas. Finally convicted, most all of them. They got sentenced, 2 of them got sentenced to basically life sentences. The others got lesser sentences. Most of them are released, but Shukri Abu Bakr and Ghassan Alashi got 65 years, and they were not young men at the time, so that's a life sentence for them. And we're still trying to get them out, but the judge, it's not easy. That's one example. The Newburgh 4, that's an example with so far a better ending, because we haven't gotten the Holy Land people out yet, but that was a sting operation where these guys were very, very poor in Newburgh, New York, an impoverished community, weren't even Muslim, had sort of started to say they were Muslim in prison because it works out better for them. They were like petty criminals. Then they get out, and one of them went to a mosque like once or twice. The FBI had sent an informant into that mosque. He couldn't find any targets there. He finds this guy in the parking lot. Long story short, he entraps him, and they had no ideology even. Usually people have like some beliefs, they're fine beliefs, but and these guys, they just wanted the money. They offered them $250,000 to participate in some fake terrorist club. And the judge shouldn't have even allowed this to go forward, but she did, and then because of the way the case was structured, there was mandatory minimum sentences of 25 years. But we were able to, with Ahmed here, who's one of our attorneys, and Steve Downs, who I mentioned before, we were able to get them released on compassionate release. But that takes a sympathetic judge, so it didn't work in some of the other cases. And then I could talk about more of them, but we probably don't have time, so.
We can revisit it.
All right, yeah, so, and since, so our study went up to 2015, and since then it's been roughly the same, and I've noticed a new trend even before October 7th, which is they've been targeting mentally ill teenagers for sting operations, and basically grooming them to commit a crime, and then arresting them after they turn 18. And one of those, in this year, in 2024, was Alexander Mercurio in Idaho. The FBI preyed on him for years. His parents were trying to get him in counseling. He wasn't Muslim. I think he became, first he was a white supremacist. He's white. And then he became like interested in ISIS. And he converted somehow to some kind of ISIS variety of Islam. I don't know. So anyway, the informant, instead of trying to help him get help, which his parents were trying to do, convinced him to plan a fake suicide plot because he was suicidal. And then they arrested him after he turned 18 and charged him with material support, and he faces 20 years in prison. And there's at least 2 other very recent similar cases of mentally ill teenagers who were charged in sting operations and face a long time in prison. So that's what it was before October 7th, or we've seen worse since then. But.
Thank you, Kathy. Now I want to turn it over to Terry to kind of do the same as far as painting a picture, give a little bit of the landscape of the situation, the political situation in the U.S., but from within the FBI, and to kind of give it from your position as an agent on the inside. You were the guy knocking on the door. after 9/11 for many years until you decided to blow the whistle. So if you could talk a little bit about what the climate was like and also why you decided to, to come to reveal that information to the public.
Yeah, definitely. I'm a little soft-spoken, so I'll try to project a little bit. Thank you for having me first. Thank you for opening your community to me and the rest of the team here. As Lena mentioned, I worked in the FBI for 17 years, and I was intimately involved in all aspects of the war on terrorism. And so I began my career in San Jose, Bay Area, in California, primarily doing surveillance. The FBI, after 9/11, determined that they wanted to saturate the community with surveillance assets, and they painted the entire community with this perspective that they were, everyone was a threat or potential had knowledge of 9/11 or somehow was involved or somehow supported. So it became this, at least a reciprocal response by the government to do whatever they could, at least in theory, to prevent another 9/11. So my career trajectory began doing surveillance operations, eventually pursuing my own cases, cases that, as Kathy mentioned, were in many ways manufactured. Right? There's a book that you guys should all read. I definitely encourage you to read, written by Trevor Aronson, called The Terror Factory, and it's about the FBI's manufactured war on terrorism. And it really details the manner in which these cases, we oftentimes, because we're propagandized heavily as a culture, right? Whether it's Hollywood, whether it's the school, the state, other elements, right? And so we have a tendency to kind of buy into the narrative of what the government says. But as far as these cases, I can tell you from personal experience, inside the rooms with the FBI, the CIA, other individuals, there's a perspective within the government that Muslims as a community, Islam as a religion, is a perpetual fifth column in the sense of, I would say existential threat, essentially. And so because of that assumption, which is obviously misplaced, they feel a great level of freedom in pursuing these cases and manufacturing these cases and essentially finding ways to justify a program that really has no basis in reality, that should not exist. It's hard. I talked to Lena, Sarwat and others here a lot about just my own process, right, of coming to terms with sort of who I was, and what I allowed myself to be, and then my eventual decision, right, in exposing that system. And I still carry that burden a lot, and it's very
We appreciate you being here, Terry. It takes a lot of courage, and I always tell Terry that, the fact that somebody like him exists was always a dream of ours, to have everything be confirmed, to find somebody in there with a conscience in the government that can, expose what's being done to our communities. So we're grateful to you, Terry.
Sorry, it's been a little emotional. It's still heavy, I got out of prison in 2020, and I'm still processing everything. I'm still coming to terms with sort of my reality and sort of, again, who I was. But again, as I said in the beginning, I'm very grateful to you for opening your community and giving us this opportunity to talk and to give you an unfiltered truth on sort of what is being done And it's not just, I think there's a lot of belief that this is kind of conspiratorial and, you're being paranoid if you think that these things are going on. But the reality is that, this is going on today. And it doesn't matter if it's because of Israel's war in Palestine or if it's because of, whatever events are happening overseas. Like, the government has dedicated countless amounts of resources and personnel to wage a war on the Muslim community. And that's, we can kind of go into more of that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Actually, if we could stay with Terry for a minute, I wanted to follow up and ask and say many are comparing the current climate in the U.S. to the aftermath of 9/11 in terms of the heightened fear and scrutiny of Arab, Palestinian, and Muslim communities. How do wars overseas affect the securitization, targeting, and surveillance of communities here? Obviously, you just said that it doesn't really matter that we are a target no matter what. But do you think that there's still going to be, or is there already an escalation? I mean, I know I've seen it on social media, but if you can talk a little bit about, what trends you've seen over the last 20 years and what's happening now.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in terms of like the actions overseas, right? You have, let's take 2003 when the Iraq invasion took place. And George Bush declared a massive war on terror and then used that as a basis to essentially just destroy that entire country and then kind of extend that to other regions, Libya, Tunisia, trying to go into Iran, others. But with that war, that physical war, there was a parallel war being waged here domestically. And so, in many ways, there's a phrase called manufactured consent, right? And what that means in many ways is these overseas operations, these actions are designed to desensitize us as a culture, as a community, to allow certain things to go on here that we should all collectively say, hey, this is not acceptable, right? We should not be sending informants into mosques, because we wouldn't send informants into, churches or Jewish community centers or whatever it is, right? But there's a belief within the government that that again, Islam is a fifth column. Muslims are a perpetual threat, and therefore these actions, right, provide the fodder to justify what the government wants to do in terms of holding the entire community under this collective suspicion and deeming them to be a threat. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely a very strong connection between those two. It can't be ignored because what happens overseas ultimately comes back here. And I think, I tell Lena this a lot, I think there's this belief, right, because within our culture, right, the government, the media, others try to they have this good Muslim, bad Muslim dichotomy. And that's used as a way to drive a wedge, right? Because if you're a good Muslim, you're going to inform, right? You're going to talk to the police, you're going to provide information on what's going on with the understanding that, maybe they'll leave my community alone and you're going to be helping, right? But that's all done. It's very underhanded. It's very deceitful. I can tell you again from personal experience, being the person on the other side that actively sent informants into mosques, actively wired people up with cameras and microphones and did these kind of things, knowing full well, and we can talk offline about this, but just, knowing full well that, this was completely misguided. Right? This was completely unethical, immoral, unjustified on so many different levels, but that's another topic.
Thank you. I want to pose the same question to Kathy as a lawyer, as somebody who's researched these cases for many years. What should communities expect now and prepare ourselves for, both in terms of targeting by law enforcement agencies and policies, legislation by the government that could affect us.
Well, I don't want to scare people, but there's definitely been a heightened sort of attacks on Muslim communities since October 7th. We haven't seen so far a large uptick in prosecutions, but I'm afraid that, like, as we're talking right now, there may be young people who are so horrified and outraged by what Israel's doing in Gaza that they may be targeted by FBI provocateurs and manipulated into either saying something or supporting Hamas in some way, or something that's going to get them in trouble, because the material support laws to terrorism are very broad. So if there's a group that the US calls a designated terrorist organization, then almost anything you have to do with that group doesn't have to be anything violent. You could even be talking to them, writing something for them, anything, advice on how to be peaceful, anything like that can be material support to terrorism. So it's a huge problem. And there's a couple bills in Congress right now that aren't directly related to prosecutions, but they're very troubling. And one is the so-called Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which passed the House already May 1st, and it's pending in the Senate. And it would codify a definition of anti-Semitism, which basically considers criticism of Israel, such as calling Israel racist, to be anti-Semitism. And if passed, it could be used with anti-discrimination laws to ban a lot of speech critical of Israel on campuses and other places. And schools not going along with it could lose federal funding. So that's one. And then there's another one, so right now, if a not-for-profit is supporting a designated terrorist organization, they can be shut down under a legal case, and that happened to the Holy Land Foundation, even though they weren't doing that. So it's not a fair process, but there is a process in court. But now, a bill that just passed the House and is pending in the Senate would allow the Treasury Department to just say that any not-for-profit is as a terrorist supporting organization, even if they're not claiming they supported any designated organization, and they wouldn't have to go to court. They would just take away their not-for-profit status automatically. And I can just imagine how this could be used if it passes. And the reason it was created, and the people promoting it say it was created specifically to go against groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, American Muslims for Palestine, is that the name of the AMP, and other pro-Palestinian groups. It has some opposition, but we'll see if it passes the Senate, so that's a really important one to oppose. And I was just thinking about, like, CCF, we give commissary money to our Muslim prisoners that we support, right? So we give them money. It doesn't really go to them. I mean, it goes to their commissary account, and then they give it to the prison to buy stuff in prison. So actually, I was thinking of this, it does end up going to terrorists, but the terrorists it ends up going to are the Bureau of Prisons. So anyway, hopefully they won't try to shut us down.
Thanks, Kathy. So I'll pose a similar question to Terry. Basically, like, you don't necessarily even have to be an activist, right? Some people may say, well, I'm not a student, I'm not an activist, I'm not out there, I'm not in the streets, like, maybe I'll be protected, but we're still seeing community members who are reporting visits from the FBI, business owners, home visits. So Terry, could you tell us a little bit about what the purpose of these visits are? How are people targeted for, questioning by the FBI, and how should community members respond if they find themselves in such a situation?
Yeah, definitely. Yes, I had a kind of a random thought as I'm sitting here listening to Kathy talk, and it's like we're coming with all this bad news, right? Like, it's very sobering, and just like not trying to put a cloud over the community about these realities. But I think, as they say, knowledge is power in many ways, and protecting ourselves and being aware of these realities is so critical to protect ourselves, our children, the vulnerable in our community. In terms of, you said, like, the purposes of these visits and sort of how they what the overall objective is. I would say from my experience, number one, it's, well, let me back up a little bit. So within the FBI, there's this belief that everyone is a potential informant. But that is the bread and butter of the FBI. There's a requirement, every agent should have about 2 or 3 informants, rats, snitches, whatever words you want to use. But there is an expectation in that regard. Couple that with the fact that there's this mistaken belief within the psyche of most FBI agents that everyone loves us, right? Everyone wants to be affiliated with the FBI. We're just like the best on the block. And so that sense of arrogance, right? That sense of self-righteousness leads itself to create this environment where agents will go into communities and they'll target. I did a talk in Dallas with a bunch of defense attorneys a few weeks ago, and I was explaining the process on how someone is targeted. Let's say I come into a community and I see someone that's I believe to be from a foreign country. So I start doing some digging. I find out, I get his license plate. From his license plate, then I can pull up, get a lot of bio data, his address, telephone number, maybe his email, and I start digging. And then from there, I can start making queries. And there's this thing called 702. It's on the news today because it's a FISA database that the FBI has access to through the NSA, which is a backdoor into, if you understand the law, it's called the Fourth Amendment, searches and seizures. And so I can then target this person who did nothing wrong, who didn't ask me to look him up, didn't really raise any suspicion whatsoever other than just being someone of interest. From there, do a targeting package and really start developing ways to turn that person into an informant.
Sorry, so you mentioned FISA.
Yeah.
So you're saying it's a wiretap then that you put on because
Yeah.
for those who don't know,
Okay, sorry.
foreign intelligence surveillance, just to.
Yeah, so it's called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which is the national security lingo for a Title III, which is another legal jargon, but it's a way of essentially listening to your phone calls, recording your emails, collecting all of that data, they call it metadata within the government, all of those details, and then using that in order to make larger connections with you and others overseas, because I think there's a safe assumption, right? If someone is from a particular country, right, whether you're from Palestine, Pakistan, Iraq, Iran, whatever, you probably have family that lives over there, right, that you call, email, whatever else. That alone can be used as a basis to then begin targeting this individual and sweeping up their information and eventually approaching them and saying, hey, you've made a phone call to this individual, why did you do that? The FBI understands that most of the community comes from countries where there's a secret police, there's that fear, right, that's kind of built into you where it's like, oh, the FBI, the police, I better cooperate, right? There's not this within, I think in some parts of the American culture that's kind of built in with us culturally where it's like, oh, well, I'm going to plead the fifth, right, which is I don't talk to the cops. I don't volunteer information unless I am being legally compelled to. So again, the targeting, it's very nefarious. It's comprehensive, and there's really no restriction because again, you're dealing with a world where it's like we have to, again, in the FBI's worldview, we want to prevent another 9/11, and so then in that regard, all bets are off, and anything can be done, any tactic can be employed, with the understanding that it will glean intelligence, right, which is FBI parlance for information of whatever value. It doesn't really mean anything, but it sounds nice. So.
To take it further, could you tell us about how confidential informants can be used in these days, and what safeguards we have or don't have? Could you talk about some of their tactics? How can we recognize the red flags and respond.
Let me start with the last part of the question. As far as the red flags, I think, it's very important for all of us to have a certain level of, we call it street smarts, right? To be savvy, to really understand when someone is trying to cultivate a relationship with you they may be pure reasons, right? I come from the school of thought where I don't trust people by default. And the worst part about the US government in the war on terrorism, and the FBI specifically, is that they exploit the community's openness and respect and affection for each other, right? And so they use that against them to then send in informants who will be embraced, right? And I'm not saying that you should shun people who come into your community, but there should be and Kathy can attest to this, if you look at all the cases, right, of the men and women who have been prosecuted over the last 20 years, 95% of them or more had started with an informant who would come in, hey, you know what, I'm new to the community, I need some help with something, and the community embraces that person, and then slowly this individual starts trying to manufacture things and create an opportunity for the FBI to meet their criminal elements to then say, hey, well, okay, how about gift cards, right? And we'll use a $20 gift card as a basis to say, you were somehow supporting ISIS, right? Because ISIS needs $20, right? And their entire operation just hinges on that. But I think in terms of being aware, you want to understand someone comes into your community, into your space, and they're saying things, right? They're trying to elicit a reaction, right? They'll come in and say, there was an informant, case went all the way to the Supreme Court, Craig Monty in Los Angeles, and he would specifically go into mosques and he would discuss what are deemed to be inflammatory topics, with the understanding that if he said these things, it would elicit a reaction from people, and that community members would respond to it with the hope that, okay, well, if I say, hey, you know what, Zionists are all evil, right? Then that informant would then probably find someone and say, oh, I agree with you. Okay, and by the way, let's be friends. And then let's also plan to have a little meeting and discuss about blowing up a Jewish temple, right? It sounds very just silly the way I'm describing it, but that's the reality of how it works, and that's how it's done. And again, I can tell you from personal experience, that's what the FBI does, and has done, and are actively doing today.
Thank you. So I just want to, have you touch on one thing, because a lot of people say this. They say, why would the government target me? I'm not doing anything. Who am I? One prisoner, said, was serving a 15-year sentence, totally railroaded and trapped. He said that he never thought that the government would target somebody like him. You have these, actual criminal enterprises out there. Who was I to the U.S. government? And so, I remember your response to that, which is, the smaller the target, the better. But if you could very briefly kind of touch on that, from how you've seen it.
There's a phrase in finance that talk a lot about Ponzi schemes, and the Ponzi scheme in the counterterrorism world is very much the way things operate. The FBI, first off, they have this massive multi-billion-dollar budget, right? They have all these agents, they have astronomical resources. They have to, first off, justify that program. How do you justify that program, right? Because the war on terrorism is very open-ended, and what does that even mean, right? Bush tried to define it, and then after the end of the Iraq War, mission was accomplished, and so that was supposed to kind of mark the end, but the war on terrorism you can't really specifically isolate and say what it is. And so because of that, it's constantly being reinvented. And in order to justify that program, you have to identify new threats, right? And the threat landscape is constantly changing, right? A few years ago, all we heard about was ISIS, Islamic State. Everyone is supporting ISIS, right? Prior to ISIS, everything was Al-Qaeda. And they would constantly throw that lingo around, and everything was Al-Qaeda. ABC said it, CNN said it, Fox said it. And so that was kind of built in. Now, because of the propaganda from Israel and its affiliates, we hear a lot about, well, it's Hamas. Everything's Hamas, right? The bees that stung the IOF soldiers the other day, those were Hamas too. And so, like, there's just this world that's kind of been created within the FBI, the national security arena, to, again, legitimize itself any way possible. Because, again, if that stops, then what are all these people going to do, right? What are all these agents? What are all these analysts, the personnel that have been hired and created? It has to maintain itself very much the same way a Ponzi scheme does. And it has to keep investing and keep throwing money at it in hopes that eventually you'll see a return.
Thank you. I want to ask Kathy, because sometimes you may be targeted by the FBI, you may have done something, you may be kind of cornered into being an informant, but as we've seen in a couple of cases, does actually becoming an informant end up saving you, or will the FBI eventually turn on you? And maybe Terry could weigh in on that as well, but I think it's important to address.
Yeah, they're always looking for informants, and Terry knows more about this than I do, but I know quite a bit about it too, because I've seen so many examples. And they'll use a lot of leverage to try to get people to inform, and one of them is like harassing people at the airports or putting them on the no-fly list, and then saying, well, you don't like that? You can help us. Or helping them with their immigration case, right? Or they have some kind of thing they could use against them if they don't cooperate and become an informant. But then once you become an informant, like, they've got their hooks in you, and they're going to want you to keep doing it and keep doing it. And we've had a couple of examples of people that went down that path and really regretted it, because they ended up much worse off, because as soon as they tried to stop doing it, all of a sudden they're trapped in a case. So it's a pretty bad idea. I wanted to talk about if the FBI tries to talk to somebody, like, no, your answer should. Yeah. So, dealing with informants is kind of tricky, because you don't know for sure if they're FBI. So you, like Terry said, you have to be savvy, and you have to see if somebody's trying to push you in a certain direction or manipulate you, show you videos, watch your reaction to stuff, and try to keep having meetings with you and all these kind of things. It's a little tricky though, because you don't necessarily want to push everybody away. But if you are, on the other hand, approached by actual FBI agents who identify themselves, that's a lot easier. It's not easy, because they make it more difficult, but because they take advantage of people's hospitality, right? You want to invite everybody into your house, but don't invite the FBI into your house. Don't talk to the FBI. They'll come, and what they do is they don't record conversations with you, and there's 2 of them, and they can lie to you legally, but if you lie to them, or even if they say you lied to them, you can be charged with a crime, and you can go to prison for years with a terrorism enhancement. So the best thing to do is, if you are ever approached by FBI agents, is to say, give me your card, I'll have my lawyer contact you. That's it. And then even if you don't have a lawyer, you say, give me your card, I'll have my lawyer contact you. There is a
you
lawyer.
all do have a lawyer. If you just email me, I'll do it.
And he's here in Atlanta, Amit Gupta. Gupta, right?
Well, it's just, I don't know how to write it. It's just Amit at civilfreedoms.org.
Oh, okay. Amit at civilfreedoms.org. So there you go. Now you all have lawyers if this happens, because it's pretty simple, really. I've done it so many times. So you call the lawyer, you don't talk to the FBI, they might be like, oh, what, you don't have anything to hide? I mean, you're not a target, it's just a friendly conversation. We're just doing outreach in the neighborhood, right? No. Just don't do it because they just want to get their hooks in you. They want to see if they can get you to be informant or get something from you or do something to you. So once the lawyer calls them, like I call them or Amith calls them and we say, we heard from so-and-so, I'm telling you I represent them and you can't talk to them. And then 98% of the time, that is the end of it. They might try again, but you just say the same thing, that's the end of it. That's it. Simple, right?
Thank you. Yeah.
I want to touch on one thing that Kathy mentioned too about airports, right? I think a lot of people in this room have family in countries all over the world. One thing to be aware of, right? Because the FBI is not always the FBI. And when I say that, what I'm referring to, there's other agencies that you deal with in the government. USCIS, right? If you have family that's trying to naturalize and you want to bring them over, you have to deal with that agency. ICE, CBP, Border Patrol, many others, even IRS. There's a thing called the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which is what the FBI created after 9/11 to bring all of the federal agencies in together at the same table and deputize them to be FBI agents in name and power, but still have the same authority of their respective agencies. And in doing that, when you cross the border, right, when you're at the airport, there's the no-fly list, but there's also the selectee list. CARE, actually, of all organizations recently, there was a report where they documented how the no-fly list, which is hundreds of thousands of names, the vast majority of those names were Muhammad, right? And it tells you a lot about the mentality of the individuals that run that list, that create it and maintain it. There's just, again, that racist, Islamophobic perception that just so pervasive that it translates into weaponizing this list to prevent people from seeing family, friends, loved ones overseas. And so you get to the airport, you're rushing, got to get there on time, and you're told you can't fly, and then out comes the FBI and a TSA agent or a CBP agent, and say, hey, if you want to fly, you got to talk to us, right? What are you going to do? You're going to cancel your flight, or are you going to sit down and have a conversation? You have to kind of think about those things. Another important point is, again, pressure that's applied to informants. The FBI knows what buttons to press. And when I talked about the JTTF and the other agencies that work in concert with the FBI, these agencies allow the FBI to say, essentially in many ways, well, you are applying for citizenship, right? Or you're trying to get asylum. Well, if you don't work with us, we're going to have your asylum package denied, right? Or we're going to maybe look into this element of your business and exert some pressure with the IRS. They have many different avenues of approach, and they are more than willing to use them. So just keep that in mind.
So what do they do in that regard then? Just to kind of, if you find yourself in that position at the airport, just because of time, I wanted to ask about that. If you find yourself in that position, I wanted to ask about your electronic devices being taken away. What do you do? And I wanted to ask you and Kathy about social media and speech, because obviously we're not here to just fearmonger, but we actually want to empower you to be able to exercise your rights without being vulnerable targets. So if we could address those things, and then I want to quickly turn it over to Sarwada. So.
Yeah, I'll be really brief then. In terms of your devices, we live in a digital world, right? Everyone carries one of these on them, and it has our entire life in there, right? Photos, emails, all our contacts, web browsing activity, any number of things. Know this, when you cross the international border, you don't have Fourth Amendment protection. Fourth Amendment is part of the Constitution that says unreasonable searches and seizures unless with a government warrant. But when you're crossing the border, you don't have Fourth Amendment protection. So the government can, in fact, seize it. So what I tell people, personally, if you're going to travel, don't bring your phone with you. Don't bring your computer with you. Don't bring your iPads with you. Pure and simple. If you do bring one, bring a clean one. Or bring one that you, if in fact they seize it from you, there's nothing on there. And they'll say, hey, why is this device empty? Because they have tools to extract the data from your phone. They can search your phone even without your consent when you're at customs. If you're flying domestically, they can't do that. But again, this is about being overseas. So we call it operational security. You want to learn that, practice it. Again, think about what you have on there and if it fell into the FBI's hands, what they would do with it. I think that's really critical. So.
Yeah, and that's good. And also there's certain platforms that are secure, like Signal is really good. Signal is like double encrypted or whatever, encrypted on both ends and very good, and you can download that. And WhatsApp is pretty good, probably not as good as Signal. And then just as far as social media, I'm not, you go ahead and post stuff on social media. You have a right to do that, and that's good, and share stuff. But just think about it. Just think about what you're saying. Like, don't just emotionally go off the handle and say something that could get you in trouble, like so-and-so should be assassinated or supporting Hamas, like because it's a designated group. So just be thoughtful about it and, try to protect yourself that way. And I just want to say also that the reason why we're seeing these laws in Congress now and this sort of wave of repression is a direct reaction to all the resistance that's going on. That's a lot stronger than that repression, right? People are standing up, and we're hearing a whole lot more about Palestine in this country and other things too, but especially Palestine right now than we've ever heard before. And so many people are concerned about it and speaking about it, and that's a good thing. And they're just, what's happening is a backlash against that of repression, but we're stronger than that, and it's a reaction to the resistance. And we're gonna prevail because the young people are doing this, so yeah.
Since we are in a masjid, I do want to pose some questions to Sarwat about what role are the mosques playing in inviting law enforcement in? Because we've seen, unfortunately, over the last 20 years, that oftentimes our own religious spaces are part of the problem. I'm sure, Terry can attest to the fact that numerous, community leaders have in fact been snitches and informants themselves who present themselves as, respected members of the community. We're actively inviting police and law enforcement. I know in one instance of a person who was convicted where the imam himself had introduced the informant to the friend group. And so based on his trust in his imam, this was a person who converted, that he got to know the informant. And so I wanted Sarwat to kind of talk about that and, what we need to do as communities to divest from our own relationships with law enforcement. And I also want Terry to add to that since he's seen it on the other side.
So I think what I've seen, because a lot of times people will say, well, I've never interacted with the FBI, someone like Terry. And I'll tell you why that's, you wouldn't know if you've interacted with an FBI agent or an informant, but regularly you do interact with law enforcement, and that's your local police. And while they're there to protect you, I'll give you a ratio. I think there's 35,000 employees in the FBI, and in terms of law enforcement, which includes the local and state police, it's for every 1,000 person, there are 3.5 police officers. So you are interacting with them. And the notion is, since you're a child, is that they're there to protect you. And that actually does not happen. What ends up happening is, and now especially particularly post 9/11, when the Department of Homeland Security was created, so it was did not exist before 9/11. It was created actually to surveil on our community through its different programs, be it TSA, be it the officer who's checking your luggage in, but also now the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which is not a government, federal government program, it's actually a statewide program. And what they do is they have what they call JTTF officers, which Terry told us about, and they collaborate with your local police. And your local police is actually tasked to do the footwork, so the scut work. So if I use the hospital analogy, the person who's collecting the blood is your local police department. Feeding it into the tech is your JTTF officer, because they literally bring it into a place called the Fusion Center. They're called Fusion Centers. They have full authority to analyze the data without any sort of expertise, and then present that data without any scrutiny or actually any sort of any critical evidence against someone to the FBI, which then presents it as a criminal case. So what I've seen in the past few years is that, when I started looking at masajid flyers, and we're having like chai with the police and biryani with the police and laddu with the police, it was scary, because when I started meeting the families of these impacted families of political prisoners, it wasn't that always there was an FBI agent at the door. There was an informant, involved, and the informant could be like this uncle that you've known for X amount of years, or this brother or sister that you know. But then they actually were in these masajid, and then 9 times out of 10, those masajids were the ones that were sort of your low-hanging fruits, where it was like a smaller masajid, the one that had more first-generation immigrants, and they applied for these grants, these Homeland Security grants. So can you imagine the whole department that was tasked to surveil us is now actually going to protect us through cameras or speakers, or someone said windows and doors. We need windows and doors. We need paint. And they're supposed to protect us, but instead, if you guys read the contract, it actually reads where it's information sharing, it's data sharing, it's space sharing. And they have sort of this contract to come into our communities and surveil us. And so, for the sake of time, I think my ask from our community would be that when I talk to these people and they say the police came to our door, it's the police and the Homeland Security officer that's coming to your door. And we need to really protect our spaces. Like, I'm looking at children that are being targeted by people who are already into these programs to become law enforcement, to become FBI officers. We have a Muslim woman that shares the same name as me, almost the same last name as me, down in Texas. And she does, what was that program called? Train your kid how to be an FBI officer. And I just don't think that these are ethical jobs, these are moral jobs. I would even borderline and say that I look for a fatwa to say these are illegitimate jobs, because they target and prey on our communities, on our brothers and sisters. And if you completely simplistically, masajid, Islamic school, our halakha spaces, our third spaces are supposed to be our sacred spaces to do hukuk Allah and hukuk ibad. And they're not supposed to be, stomping grounds for the government to come prey on someone who is Down syndrome, autistic, poor, Black, Yemeni, undocumented. These are not spaces for that. Allah says to protect those communities that are the most vulnerable, because those are the ones that are the most beloved and closer to Him. And when I see, it is you will think that this is, what I'm saying is such common sense, or such in light of the faith, but between the few of us here and staff that's sitting on the side, it is very hard to convince our spaces, our big shuyukh, our big scholars, to distance themselves from these communities, from these agencies, Homeland Security, ICE, FBI, JTTF. They're giving us awards for Hijab Day. I don't need an award from the New York Police Department I'm New Jersey based, and that was ground zero for 9/11. You know, I had police officers putting their knuckles through my hijab to see if I'm, you know, safe enough. I was an 18-year-old child at that time. So we don't need these spaces to be those kind of spaces. They should be for cultivating and nourishing and protecting and empowering our youth, our community, our Muslims, and then we should look parallel to other communities like the Black community, which we stand on their feet, on their backs. They've built this nation in the conditions they have, and we should look and read their history to see that, you know, when they are oppressed by this institution, what is it that they did so wrong that they deserve this, and we should learn from it. But I would plead our community, like if you're community members, you can push back and say, you know what, I don't want the police to come to the masjid. They're outside, they can direct traffic, and that's great. We don't want them in here, we don't want the FBI in here, we don't want Homeland Security in here, we don't need training, we're fine. I have flyers that I can show to anyone who wants to see it afterwards. Everything that Terry told you, now imagine if that's the work that he gets paid to do. Those are the people that are gonna come in and train us how to be safe and know your rights. That cannot be possible, right? Like it cannot work like that. It logically doesn't make sense. So I'm gonna hand it over.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much for having us. We've been trying to get into Masajid for a long time. Believe it or not, people aren't interested in having these uncomfortable conversations. So we're grateful to all of you for having us here, opening your community to have this discussion. So thank you.